The rhythmic scrape of the handplane against white oak was the only sound in the shop, a steady, grounding vibration that traveled up my forearms and settled in my chest. Outside, the Portland rain was coming down in sideways sheets, hammering the corrugated steel roof of my warehouse with a deafening, chaotic tempo. It was 1:45. The air inside smelled sharply of aliphatic resin, sawdust, and the bitter dregs of a cold pot of coffee. I blew a curl of wood shaving off the edge of the dining table I was finishing, running my thumb along the raw grain to check for runout. It was perfectly smooth. The world outside was not. A sharp, frantic hammering hit the heavy steel of the loading bay door. My hand stopped. The blade of the plane bit into the wood, halting its glide. No one came to the industrial district at this hour, not in this weather. I set the tool down, the heavy cast iron clinking softly against the workbench. I wiped the sawdust from my jeans, my pulse maintaining its slow, deliberate rhythm, a habit born of a mind that always defaulted to triage and assessment before reaction. I walked toward the front entrance, the concrete floor cold beneath my boots, and unlatched the heavy deadbolt. I pulled the heavy door open against the wind. Aurora Evans stood on the concrete threshold, illuminated by the harsh, flickering amber of the street lamp. She was shivering violently, her arms wrapped tight around her chest as if holding herself together. She wore a heavy beige knit cardigan layered over a thin white scoop-neck top, the fabric completely soaked through at the shoulders and clinging to her skin against the biting cold. Her dark, wavy hair was a wet, tangled mess, plastering against her cheeks and framing eyes that were red, swollen, and rimmed with fresh tears. The sheer panic radiating from her posture hit me like a physical weight. She looked up at me, her chest heaving with shaky exhales.
"Don't make me go back tonight," she whispered, her voice cracking over the roar of the rain.
I didn't ask questions. I didn't ask why the brilliant 34-year-old interior designer who had hired me to build the custom fixtures for her downtown restaurant project was standing at my shop in the middle of a monsoon. Tactical logic dictated one immediate action: secure the perimeter and neutralize the environmental hazard. "Come inside," I said, my voice low and level. I stepped back, opening the door wider to shield her from the wind. She stepped over the threshold, her boots leaving muddy water on the clean concrete. I closed the heavy steel door behind her, throwing the deadbolt and engaging the secondary chain lock with a solid metallic clack. The sudden quiet of the insulated shop wrapped around us, blocking out the howling wind. I pulled a clean, dry flannel shirt from the hook by the office door and held it out to her. "Put this on." "You're freezing," I said, keeping my distance, ensuring I didn't crowd her space. Aurora took the shirt with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry, Jackson," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "I didn't know where else to go. My studio. He found my studio." "Stop apologizing," I instructed calmly, pointing toward the small enclosed office in the corner of the warehouse where a space heater glowed. "Go sit by the heat. I'll make tea." I moved to the small kitchenette in the back, my mind cataloging the variables. He, Mark, the ex-boyfriend she had briefly mentioned during our initial project meetings, the one she said had trouble accepting the word no. I filled the electric kettle, the sound of the rushing water loud in the quiet shop. When I walked into the office carrying 2 steaming mugs of chamomile, she was sitting in my worn leather desk chair, engulfed in my oversized plaid shirt, staring blankly at the wall. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a thick manila folder she had clutched under her cardigan. I set the mug on the desk within her reach, then pulled up a wooden stool, sitting a respectful 3 feet away. I kept my hands resting on my knees, perfectly still. "Drink," I said. She took a shaky sip, the warmth bringing a faint flush back to her pale cheeks. She set the mug down and pushed the damp folder across the desk toward me. The edges of the paper were curled from the humidity. "He's been leaving notes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At my apartment? On my windshield? Tonight I was working late at the design studio. I heard someone trying the back door handle, just rattling it over and over. When I looked out the window, I saw his truck parked across the street. He sent me a message right after. She pulled out her phone, her thumb sliding across the cracked screen, and handed it to me. I looked at the glowing screen. "I know you're in there, Aurora. You can't just ignore me. We have to talk." There were 20 missed calls logged in the last hour. My jaw tightened, a hard knot of anger forming in my chest, but I kept my face entirely impassive. Panic is contagious, and I refused to feed hers. "You did the right thing coming here," I told her, my tone flat, factual, and completely certain. "He doesn't know this address?" She shook her head. "No, I strictly kept you as a vendor in my files, but Jackson, I can't keep running. He's documenting my schedule. He knows where I am. I feel like I'm going crazy." Her voice broke, a small sob escaping her lips. "You aren't crazy," I said, pulling a notepad from the desk drawer and grabbing a pen. "This is documented harassment. It's a pattern, and it's escalating. We are going to build a firewall around your life, starting right now." I began writing a list, numbering the items with sharp, precise strokes. Item 1. You stay here tonight. The shop is a concrete bunker with reinforced steel doors. Item 2. Tomorrow morning, we assess your apartment's physical security. Item 3. We compile this folder and your call logs into a chronological ledger. You are not dealing with this alone anymore. Aurora looked at the list, then up at me. The frantic terror in her eyes began to slow, replaced by a fragile, tentative relief. She exhaled a long, shaky breath, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. She didn't have to carry the entire weight of the logistics for the next 8 hours. "Okay," she whispered, leaning back in the chair. "Okay." I nodded once. I stood up, taking my keys from my pocket. "I'm going to do a perimeter check of the exterior doors in the loading dock. Drink your tea. Lock this office door from the inside until I knock 3 times. I spent the next 20 minutes walking the perimeter of the warehouse in the freezing rain. I checked the heavy iron hinges, tested the padlock on the secondary gate, and ensured the motion sensor floodlights were active. The cold water seeped through my jacket, but I barely registered it. My focus was absolute, calibrated to the singular task of rendering the environment impenetrable. When I returned, I knocked 3 times on the office door. The lock clicked, and Aurora opened it, looking slightly more grounded. I set up a heavy canvas cot in the office, bringing her a clean sleeping bag and a heavy wool blanket. "I'll be out in the shop," I told her, pausing in the doorway. "I'm a light sleeper. If you need anything, just call out." "Jackson," she said softly into the quiet room. I stopped and looked back. She was clutching the edge of the wool blanket. "Thank you for not asking 100 questions, for just letting me be safe." "Rest, Aurora," I said simply. I pulled the door shut until it clicked securely. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my drafting table in the main shop under the dim glow of a single brass lamp, a block of sandpaper in my hand, methodically smoothing the edges of a custom joint. I listened to the rain, and I listened for the sound of any vehicle pulling into the gravel lot. There was only the storm. The next morning, the rain had reduced to a fine gray mist. I made coffee, the rich smell of French roast filling the sawdust-scented air. When I walked back to the office, Aurora was awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, her damp hair now pulled back into a messy knot. The daylight made the exhaustion under her eyes more prominent, highlighting the toll the chronic anxiety was taking on her. "I have to go back to my apartment," she said immediately, her voice tight with renewed stress. "I need clothes, my laptop, my hard drive with the restaurant blueprints. If I miss the client deadline on Friday, I lose the contract. I can't let him take my business away from me." "We will get your equipment," I agreed, pouring her a mug of coffee and handing it to her. "But we do it methodically. I drove us to her apartment complex in my heavy utility truck. The neighborhood was quiet, the wet pavement reflecting the overcast sky. We parked a block away, observing the street. No sign of the ex's truck. We walked quickly up to her second-floor unit. As soon as she slid her key into the deadbolt, I noticed the heavy scratch marks around the brass casing of the lock. "Wait!" I commanded sharply, putting a hand out to stop her from turning the key. I leaned in close, inspecting the brass. Someone had tried to force the cylinder with a tension wrench and a pick, likely recently given the lack of oxidation on the fresh scratches. The lock hadn't fully yielded, but the internal pins were damaged. "He tried to pick it," I stated, the reality of the physical intrusion hanging heavy in the damp hallway air. "The mechanism is compromised. It's barely holding." Aurora stared at the scratches, the color draining completely from her face. She swayed slightly on her feet, the reality of her shattered sanctuary hitting her all at once. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gripped my forearm just to stay upright. The transfer of stability was instantaneous. I locked my knees and braced my stance, letting my solid frame anchor her spinning panic. The world stopped tilting for her as my calm flowed into the chaotic void of her fear. "He was trying to get in," she breathed, terrified. "He failed," I corrected smoothly, "and he won't get another chance." I took the key from her shaking fingers, manipulated the damaged cylinder with careful pressure, and pushed the door open. I stepped inside first, clearing the small, stylishly decorated apartment room by room. It was empty. "Clear," I called out. Aurora rushed to her desk, shoving her laptop, external hard drives, and project files into a leather tote bag. She moved frantically to her bedroom, tossing clothes into a duffel. While she packed, I walked to the front door. I pulled my heavy leather tool belt from my truck, bringing my impact driver, a set of 3-inch structural screws, and a heavy-duty steel strike plate I always kept in my rig. The original strike plate on her door frame was secured with pathetic half-inch screws that barely bit into the drywall. A solid kick would have blown the door wide open. I removed them, replacing the flimsy metal with the reinforced steel plate, driving the long structural screws deep into the wooden framing studs behind the drywall. The impact driver whined sharply, driving the metal home with absolute finality. I then replaced the damaged deadbolt cylinder with a high-security core I had in my spare parts kit. When Aurora walked out of the bedroom, carrying her bags, she stopped and stared at the door. I turned the deadbolt. It slid into place with a heavy, impenetrable thud. "It's secured into the structural framing," I explained, packing away my tools. "A battering ram would take the whole wall down before that lock gives way." She reached out and touched the heavy steel plate, her fingertips tracing the solid metal. She didn't say anything, but her chest stopped heaving. The frantic energy bled out of the room. She looked at me, her red-rimmed eyes meeting mine. "You just fixed it. Just like that." "Problems have mechanical solutions," I said quietly, picking up her heavy duffel bag so she wouldn't have to carry it. "Let's get back to the shop." For the next 4 days, my warehouse became our shared fortress. We established a compact routine, a domestic rhythm built entirely around practical necessity and quiet proximity. During the day, the cavernous space hummed with the noise of industry. I worked on the restaurant tables, running rough lumber through the massive thickness planer, the screaming whine of the blades reducing raw wood to perfectly parallel surfaces. I used a Japanese pole saw to cut precise dovetails, the fine teeth slicing through the hardwood with a satisfying rhythmic rasp. Aurora set up her temporary design studio at my drafting desk in the office. She worked furiously on her blueprints, her brow furrowed in concentration. Every couple of hours, the noise of my machinery would stop. I would wipe the sawdust from my hands, walk into the office, and place a fresh glass of water or a plate of sliced apples on the edge of her desk without saying a word. She would look up, offer a small, tired smile, and murmur a quiet, "Thank you." I noticed everything about her. I noticed the way she chewed on the end of her stylus when a floor plan wasn't working. I noticed the specific, heavy sigh she let out when she received an email from a difficult contractor. I noticed how fiercely independent she was, fighting to keep her business afloat despite the psychological warfare her ex was waging. I admired her grit. I admired the absolute brilliance of her design work, the way she envisioned space and light. And I felt the constant, low-level pull of wanting to step closer, to smooth the tension from her shoulders. But I didn't. I kept my hands firmly in the pockets of my canvas work pants. The tension between us wasn't built on fleeting physical heat. It was built on a foundation of absolute restraint. I maintained a safe, respectful distance because her world felt out of control, and I refused to be another unpredictable variable in it. On Thursday afternoon, the routine shattered. I was at the workbench, carefully applying a coat of clear Danish oil to a finished tabletop, the rich amber color of the walnut pulling to the surface. Aurora walked out of the office, her phone clutched in her hand, her face completely drained of color. "You went to my clients," she said, her voice hollow. I put down the oil rag. "Explain." "The restaurant owners. The ones we're doing this build for," she said, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. "Mark sent them an email. He told them I'm unstable. He told them I'm going through a mental breakdown and that I'm defaulting on my vendors. He attached a fake timeline saying my designs are months behind schedule. He's trying to sabotage the contract, to force me to crawl back to him." A cold, methodical anger crystallized in my chest. Social sabotage. He was attempting to destroy her professional reputation, the one thing she valued most, to strip away her independence. "They want to meet," Aurora continued, a tear spilling over her lower lash line. "Tomorrow morning at the site." They sounded panicked. "Jackson, if they pull funding, I lose everything. I can't prove my stability when I look like a wreck hiding in a warehouse." She covered her face with her hands, a jagged sob tearing from her throat. The pressure had finally cracked her armor. She was collapsing under the weight of the unfairness. I didn't think. I crossed the shop floor in 3 long strides. I stood in front of her, the smell of sawdust and finishing oil lingering in the air. "Look at me," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave, completely steady. She dropped her hands, her eyes wide and wet. I reached out and wrapped my arms around her shoulders, pulling her against my chest. I didn't hold her tight. I held her solid. The moment her face pressed against my flannel shirt, the vast, echoing noise of the warehouse, the storm, the emails, the sabotage, it all muted into a sudden, absolute silence. My physical presence acted as a heavy acoustic barrier against the chaos of her world. She let out a long, shuddering exhale, the tension bleeding out of her spine as she leaned her full weight into my frame. I rested my chin lightly on the top of her head, staring at the concrete wall, focusing entirely on the psychological relief I was providing. I was the quiet room. She was safe here. After a long minute, I stepped back, creating space. I looked her in the eyes. "He sent them a fake timeline," I stated, shifting immediately back to logistics. "We will show them the real one. We will show them the physical proof. I am your lead fabricator. I know exactly where the build stands." "You'd come with me?" she asked, blinking away the remaining tears. "I am the contractor. It's my job to update the client on material progress," I replied smoothly, protecting her pride so she didn't have to ask for a favor. "Print the call logs. Print the emails he sent you. Compile the folder. We end this tomorrow." Friday morning, the sky was a bruised, heavy purple. We drove to the unfinished restaurant site downtown. The interior was framed out, smelling of fresh drywall mud and raw concrete.
The two owners, a tense-looking couple in business casual, were waiting near the front entrance, holding clipboards. Aurora stepped out of my truck, wearing a sharp, tailored blazer over a black turtleneck. She looked professional, composed, and formidable. I walked 2 paces behind her, carrying a thick binder of schematics and fabrication logs, acting as a silent, immovable anchor at her back. "Aurora," the male owner said, crossing his arms, "we need to talk about this email we received regarding your capacity to finish this project." Aurora didn't flinch. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. "The email you received was from Mark Davis. He is my former partner, and he is currently engaged in a documented campaign of harassment against me because I ended our relationship," she said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative in the empty room. "Inside this envelope is a copy of the cease and desist notice filed by my attorney yesterday, along with a statement of fact." The owners blinked, clearly caught off guard by her direct, unflinching honesty. She didn't hide from the shame. She weaponized the truth. "As for the project timeline," she continued, turning slightly to gesture to me, "I brought my lead custom fabricator, Jackson Hart. He can speak to the physical deliverables." I stepped forward, opening the heavy binder. "The custom dining tables are 90% complete," I stated, my voice projecting calm authority. "The white oak bar top is milled, joined, and currently acclimatizing in my climate-controlled shop. I have all material receipts, timestamps, and photographic evidence of the build progress cataloged in this ledger. We are not behind schedule. We are currently 4 days ahead of the critical path milestone." I handed the open binder to the owners. They looked at the highly detailed spreadsheets, the precise material lists, the photographic proof of the finished carpentry. The measurable reality of my work instantly dismantled the digital lies her ex had spun. The tension in the owner's shoulders vanished. The woman let out a long breath. Okay, we apologize, Aurora. When we got that email, we panicked. We didn't know the context." "I understand," Aurora said gracefully. "But moving forward, all communication regarding this project comes from me. No one else speaks for my business." "Understood," the man agreed, handing the binder back to me. We walked back to the truck in silence. As soon as both doors slammed shut, enclosing us in the cab, Aurora let out a shaky laugh. She covered her face, but this time, it wasn't a breakdown. It was the adrenaline crash of victory. "You did that," I said quietly, putting the keys in the ignition but not starting the engine. "You owned the room. You protected your work." She turned to me in the small space of the truck cab. The distance between us felt suddenly charged, the air heavy with a profound shift in closeness. She reached out and placed her hand over mine where it rested on the center console. Her touch was warm, deliberate, and grounding. "We did that," she corrected softly. "I couldn't have walked in there without knowing you were standing right behind me." I looked down at her hand covering mine, my pulse hammering a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. I wanted to turn my hand over and intertwine our fingers. I wanted to pull her across the center console. I forced my hand to remain perfectly still, prioritizing her comfort, accepting the touch simply as a transfer of trust. "I'll always back your play, Aurora," I said, the absolute truth of it settling between us. But the victory was short-lived. When we returned to the warehouse an hour later, a heavy white envelope was taped to the steel front door. It had Aurora's name written across the front in thick black marker. I told her to stay in the truck. I walked up, peeled the tape off the metal, and opened the flap. Inside was a printed photograph. It was a picture of my warehouse, taken from the street at night. In the window of the office, you could see Aurora's silhouette sitting at the drafting desk. Clipped to the photo was a printed note. "You think a new guy and a locked door changes anything? I know where you sleep. I'll see you soon." A cold, lethal calm washed over my brain. The harassment had crossed from digital annoyance to physical stalking. He had tracked her here. He was escalating, trying to force an ultimatum through terror. I walked back to the truck and handed her the photograph. She stared at it, the color draining from her lips. The sanctuary was breached. "He was outside," she whispered, her eyes wide with fresh horror. "He watched me. Jackson, I'm bringing this to your door. I'm putting you in danger. I have to leave. I have to go somewhere else." She reached for the door handle, her panic overriding her logic. I reached across and placed my hand over the door latch, physically blocking her exit without gripping her arm. "You are not leaving," I said, my voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. "This changes nothing about your safety. It only changes our timeline." "He's threatening you now," she cried out. "He's a coward taking pictures in the dark," I replied coldly, dismissing the threat to myself entirely. Item 1. We take this directly to the police station right now. This is the documented threat required for an emergency protective order. Item 2. We file it. Item 3. We legally compel him to stay away, and if he violates it, he goes to a concrete cell. We do not run. We end it. We drove straight to the precinct. The waiting room was sterile, filled with hard plastic chairs and the hum of fluorescent lights. Aurora sat rigidly beside me, clutching her heavy binder of evidence. I sat beside her, my posture relaxed but vigilant. I didn't speak, knowing words wouldn't help. Instead, I shifted my chair 2 inches closer, positioning my broad shoulders between her and the rest of the room, creating a physical shield against the world without touching her. When the detective called us back, Aurora laid out the binder. The chronological logs, the emails, the destroyed door lock report, and finally, the photograph from the warehouse. The detective reviewed the file, nodding grimly. "This is textbook escalation, Ms. Evans. The photograph establishes a clear physical threat. We can expedite a temporary restraining order today. A judge will sign it this afternoon, and we will serve Mr. Davis immediately. He will be legally ordered to surrender any firearms and stay 500 feet away from you, your residence, and this warehouse address." "Will it stop him?" she asked, her voice small. "If it doesn't, it gives us the legal authority to arrest him the second he crosses the line," the detective assured her. We spent 3 hours filling out the lawful paperwork. I sat quietly beside her, verifying timestamps and reading through the legal clauses to ensure the boundaries were airtight. When she signed the final affidavit, her pen hovered over the paper for a fraction of a second, a moment of finality. She signed her name with a sharp, decisive stroke. When we walked out of the courthouse, the rain had finally stopped. The late afternoon sun broke through the heavy cloud cover, casting long golden shadows across the wet pavement. Aurora stopped on the sidewalk, looking down at the stamped copy of the protective order in her hands. The legal surrender. It was over. The boundary was drawn in ink and enforced by the state. She let out a breath that seemed to carry weeks of accumulated terror out of her lungs. "It's done," I said, standing beside her. She looked up at me. "I couldn't have done this alone. I would have caved. I would have run away." "You wouldn't have," I corrected gently. "You fought him every step. I just handed you the right tools." We returned to the warehouse. That evening, the atmosphere in the shop was entirely different. The heavy, oppressive tension had evaporated, leaving behind a quiet, comfortable domesticity. I cooked dinner on a small hot plate, simple pasta with olive oil and garlic, and we ate sitting on stools at the workbench, surrounded by the smell of finished wood. "I'll look for a new apartment tomorrow," Aurora said quietly, tracing the rim of her water glass. "With the order in place, I can safely move." I looked down at my plate, a sudden, heavy ache blooming in my chest. The practical crisis was resolved.
My job as the protector, the temporary sanctuary, was obsolete. The logical next step was her departure. I accepted this, clamping down on the urge to ask her to stay. I refused to use her gratitude as leverage to keep her near me. "I can help you move your things," I offered, my voice neutral, offering a service rather than a plea. "I have the truck." She looked at me, a long, searching gaze that seemed to peel back my stoic layers. She stood up from the stool, walked around the workbench, and stood directly in front of me. She didn't look like a woman who was running away. She looked entirely grounded, her posture confident and relaxed. "Jackson," she said softly. "The restaurant owners are hosting a soft opening preview next Friday night for investors and contractors. It's a formal event. I have it on my schedule to do the final punch list walkthrough that morning," I replied, missing her point entirely, my mind still locked on logistics. She smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached her eyes. "I'm not asking you to work, Jackson. I'm asking you to attend. With me." I froze. I looked at her, searching her face for any sign of obligation or pity. There was none. There was only a quiet, steady invitation. She was making a public choice, offering me a place in her real life outside the concrete walls of this bunker. "As your contractor?" I asked, my voice slightly rough. "As my partner," she corrected, her voice unwavering. She reached out, both of her hands grasping my forearms. The touch was deliberate, an anchor dropped in deep water. All the discipline, all the restraint I had practiced over the last 8 weeks dissolved into the quiet certainty of her grip. The wandering was over. The fighting had stopped. I leaned down, closing the distance between us. When my lips met hers, there was no frantic exploration, no desperate hunger. It was the heavy, grounding sensation of a deadbolt sliding into place, the absolute finality of coming home. The kiss was a seal on a promise made entirely without words, a promise of stability, of quiet mornings, and of a sanctuary built not of concrete and steel, but of mutual trust. When we finally pulled away, resting our foreheads together, the warehouse was completely silent. The storm was gone. "I'll buy a suit," I whispered. Closing thoughts. I learned that true safety isn't found in reinforced doors or heavy locks. It is built through the quiet, consistent choices of someone who respects your boundaries enough to stand still when you need space and steps forward the moment you need a shield. Love isn't about rescuing someone so they owe you. It's about handing them the tools to reclaim their own strength. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.